Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar. We're going to give it 30 seconds so for everyone to come in, and then we're going to start. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this new webinar. I'm excited to be here today and introduce this webinar, which is a joint webinar between Lightcast and AIHR, the Academy to Innovate HR. And we are here to talk about the impact of AI in the labor market, and more specifically, the impact of AI in human resources and what HR can do to prepare for this next phase of the future of work and the labor market. I'm here today by Marna van der Merwe and Dieter Welsman from AIHR. Dieter will be chairing the conversation today, but before we get into the conversation, a few housekeeping and logistics. There will be time for Q&A at the end. Make sure that you drop your questions in the chat, and we will make sure to answer them throughout the discussion. And if we cannot get to them throughout the discussion, we will make sure to get to them afterwards. And there will also be polls throughout, so make sure you keep an eye out for them, because we want to make sure that this webinar is interactive and to get your takes on some of the things that we are discussing. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Dieter to chair the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Elena, and good afternoon to everybody, wherever you are dialing in from. It's really fantastic to have you with us. I have the fantastic opportunity to put Elena and Marna in the hot seat during the course of this particular webinar. And what I would like to do, just to set the tone, is really to divide it into four parts. We're first going to talk a little bit around what were the summary of the findings of the Lightcast report, and Elena is going to give us some high-level overview of what the impact of AI is currently in the labor market. Marna, after that, I'm going to come to you to talk about, but what does that mean for us as HR professionals, and specifically to talk about what does AI adoption look like within HR. We'll take it slightly broader again in terms of how do we see AI actually transforming organizations, and what is adoption actually looking like in practice, because I think that there was some really interesting insights out of the joint research there as well. And then we'll wrap it up with one of my favorite topics, which is a lot more around what are the skill sets that we need to build in terms of really making sure that people are prepared for this next wave of AI implementation in organizations as well. So I think on that note, Elena, I'm going to come to you first in terms of perhaps just giving us a bit of an overview of what were some of the main findings of the research in the report, and how's that applicable to us around the table today?
Yes, so for those of you who are not familiar or have come across this report for the first time, back in July, we published Beyond the Buzz, which was our attempt to cut through the noise and get practical and specific about what is happening in the labor market right now in terms of impact of artificial intelligence, and try to guide the organizations that we work with to smartest decision making around training and hiring in relation to this period of time and turbulence. And while we did this research, we had three key findings that really jumped out for us. The first one was really about what actually means AI jobs and what part of the labor markets are affected by it. And the key finding there is actually AI job doesn't necessarily mean tech jobs anymore. Up until a few years ago, AI was simply associated with tech. We thought of it as software developer, data scientist, etc. Nowadays, there's more and more job functions that are using AI. And actually, when we look at job postings, a signal of recruitment activity, what we see is that 51% of job postings requiring AI skills are now outside tech. So that is a big impact that we're seeing spread out right across the labor market. And then the second point is that not only is this demand spread across the labor market, but employers are willing to pay a premium for people that have these AI skills. So workers that have AI skills are considered at an advantage, and this advantage can be measured using an online job postings activity and looking at the type of information that companies put in this in their job postings at about 28%. So there is a 28% salary premium, which in US dollar terms is equivalent to $18,000 per year, that employers are willing to pay for workers with AI skills. But then the third point of this discussion, which is what makes it interesting and what actually brings us also here today, is that actually different career areas and job functions are at different stages of adoption when it comes to AI. And we really need to understand what stage they're in and what their priorities are if we want to make the implementation more impactful and efficient.
Perfect. Elena, thank you so much for that overview. I think it sets the tone really, really well for us to deep dive a little bit. And there's a couple of things that really stand out for me in terms of the summary that you've provided. I think the first one is definitely this idea around how do we make the insights pertaining to AI practical? I think definitely the point that you've made around us cutting through the noise. I think whenever you open up any sort of feed, it doesn't matter where you get your news, there's something there related to AI, and we need AI skills, and AI is changing work. But I think to really get into the weeds of things there a little bit around, but what does that mean today, and what does that really mean for individuals? Mana, I want to come to you there a little bit more, and let's make it relevant. I think specifically, and I know careers is one of your favorite subjects as well in terms of what Elena spoke about. But let's talk a bit about what are we seeing around AI adoption in some of the research that you are doing, as well as the work with our clients at AIHR. What is some of the things that's standing out to you that links to some of the findings of this report as well?
Yeah, I think definitely what we see within HR is not very different to what's happening broadly around AI adoption. So I think there's three things that stand out for me that I think is worth mentioning that's perhaps unique to HR. I definitely think the urgency and the realization that AI is powerful and can transform how we work in HR is something that most HR teams feel. So everyone
Mm,
wants to adopt AI, and there's a big drive to figure out and buy tools. So on the one hand, it's great because we see for the first time, I think, in decades that HR is actually transforming how we work, and I think that's a great good news story. But we also see the knee-jerk reaction under the pressure of adopting AI. So we hear of a
mm,
lot of failed AI experiments or having to roll back certain initiatives or investments just not panning out the way that we thought it would. So I think we definitely see a lot more AI use, and I think we've been tracking it over the last 18 months, and it's a lot more prevalent than it has been before. So there's a upward adoption trend. I think when we look a little bit closer, we do see a lot of that adoption happening at individual level for HR
mm,
professionals. So using it to work smarter, better, more efficiently. And we've seen a big increase in adoption actually on that level. I think at the same time, we also see, and when we ask HR professionals around their readiness, most HR teams and HR professionals feel quite unequipped, which is an interesting paradox when we see the increase in adoption, the increase in use, the increase in investment, but still a large proportion of HR professionals and teams actually feeling that they're not quite ready to reap those benefits. And of course,
mm.
that's something that is driving a lot of our further research as well. But I think an interesting one to tackle because that has real implications for the skills that we build, but then also the level of investment that we will get in AI tools, which has a downstream impact as well. So, in a nutshell, I think those are probably the three big things in HR that we are seeing in the work of our clients.
And I think to add to that, what definitely stands out from what you've mentioned there is, I think, this struggle that a lot of HR professionals have to go beyond individual level adoption, right? I think that there's been such a strong, significant drive to AI everywhere. What are you doing with AI? You need to utilize AI. And I can definitely also see that the conversation has definitely shifted from what tool sets are you using versus how valuable is AI really for you? And is it actually gaining an impact beyond just being interesting and novel? And I think that's definitely something that we've started to see and experience a lot more in the HR space. We'll deep dive into skills a little bit later, but I think the point that you make is really interesting around this perception of feeling unequipped. Because to Elena, to come back to your earlier point that you've mentioned, if we are now starting to go beyond the traditional technology role and job families, it's actually quite interesting around what does being equipped mean at the moment, and what does that look like? Because 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, especially in the generative AI space, we all kind of started from the same base level of proficiency. And some of the teams and some of the functions have definitely started to shift a little faster and a little bit more there. Before we deep dive into this next point, I think we're going to ask a very, very quick poll here just to hear from you joining us today as well, in terms of what role does AI actually play in your organization today when you think about how HR is engaging and is utilizing AI at the moment. So if we can launch that poll there, what we would love to know from you is it a support role? So things like it assists with data. Is it more a role around being a strategic partner? It informs our decision making. Is it about a pilot project? Mana, your point around it's all about experimentation, but does that actually translate back into some of the things that we need to do there? Is it driving change? Or to be very honest, and as I hear from a lot of HR professionals I engage with, it's still a tool we use. It's not necessarily something that's integrated or that is a really part of our team, and what we do there. So we can launch that poll. Would love to hear from you in terms of what your questions, or what the perception is, at least at the moment, in terms of how you engage and how we utilize AI in your organization. Drum roll as the answers start coming in. Without influencing it, so that we are at least valid and apply rigor in our research, Elena, Marna, what are your bets on in terms of what people see? Oh, too fast for that. So quite an interesting split, and I'd love your quick comments on this as well. So 42% of people still say, from an HR point of view, definitely in a support role. Um, Only 7% say it's a strategic partner. I think that definitely resonates with what we also hear from our clients on a daily basis. A lot of people still in the pilot project phase. I think very much this phase on go and experiment. And then lastly, a change driver for transformation. We're going to talk about that in terms of what are you doing right there to start seeing AI really as a force that is transforming the workforce. Elena, can I go to you first before we jump into the next section? But what surprises you from the results that we've seen from the poll?
I think the results don't surprise me too much, in the sense that we are still all navigating in the dark. So seeing most people voting for the support role, that kind of resonates with me. But I think, and I hope that with this webinar today, we'll help move people more from that box to the game changer and strategic partners, because that's where we unlock the true potential of it.
Absolutely. Marna, your view?
No, the same. I'm actually surprised at the amount of people in kind of pilot phase. I thought that would be much higher. So it's also good to see that some things move out of pilot phase. No, so I think no surprises except for for that.
So let's push on a bit in terms of, but what does that then actually mean for us? Because I think what we can see from the poll and also what came out of the report, Ilona, that you've mentioned earlier, is really this idea around what does adoption mean? When I engage with a lot of people, they say, oh, you need to adopt AI. And then usually my next question is, but what does adoption mean? Does it mean I play with tools? Does it mean it's really, really integrated? And I think we can acknowledge that people are very much at different stages, as you've mentioned. So would you mind walking us through what does this look like for different functions at the moment? And then specifically, how does this relate to HR? What have we seen that shifted over the last couple of months?
Yep. So I'm going to show you two slides. First, we start big, so taking the full picture of the labor market. Second one, we zoom in on the HR function. But when it comes to the whole labor market, as we were saying earlier, the third key point of the research is that different job functions are at different stages on their AI journey. And here we can think of the AI journey in two different ways: adoption and growth of the adoption over time. And this is what this chart here does. So if you are higher up on the chart, that means that you have a higher adoption of AI. So AI in your job function is used most frequently. And at the top, no surprise, you have information technology, because that's where AI came from to begin with. But we also see that adoption is high in functions like marketing and science and finance and engineering. So again, it goes to the point that AI is not just something that's happening in tech, it's something that we're seeing spreading in the labor market. And the second point, so how far on the right you are on this chart, actually signals the growth in the last year. And here we see that beyond performing arts, actually the job function that has seen the biggest growth in adoption of AI in the last year is actually HR. So that's where HR fits in the bigger picture. But then, even within HR, there is actually quite a big difference in terms of who is adopting AI. And so, what you see here are some of the examples of how AI is being used within the HR function, but also the share of job postings within the HR function that mention AI in different occupations and roles that belong to HR. And what we see here, and that was one of the things that started the discussion between Lightcast and AIHR, was really about how the demand for AI in HR is coming from the bottom up. So a lot of the roles that are using AI tools are those on the ground. So it is the talent acquisition specialists, the talent acquisition managers, the recruiters. They're using AI to do a whole bunch of things, from resume screening to checking the initial credential of candidates, as well as identify potential high potential candidates. So they're doing a lot of the work, and the work is coming from the ground rather than from the managers.
I love that, and thanks so much for sharing. And I think it also resonates quite a bit. 2 years ago or so, when we were talking about what does AI adoption in HR look like, we were kind of middle of the pack, and I think that's been a trend that we've seen with previous technologies in HR as well. I grew up in the HR profession, so I'm a very, very passionate HR professional, and I know that sometimes we are a little risk averse because we also know what happens when things go wrong. So I think similar to functions such as legal, finance, risk, etc., I think there is quite a big component of first seeing, but what is out there? What does this mean, or what does this look like? Extremely interesting for me, your finding there, Elena, around the fact that in the last year we've seen the significant speed of adoption, if I might call it, within HR, and how quickly that has started to just progress. Marna, can you shed a bit of light on that? And I think Elena's given us a really good tee up there in terms of some of the functions that have leaned into AI a little bit more. But what is the state of AI adoption in these functions, and what do you think is the reason for these functions leading the pack within HR?
Yeah, I think it's always nice to see when data validates what you kind of intuitively feel. And I think we've definitely seen a lot of the very cautious, risk averse behavior fading slightly, and HR professionals really stepping up and experimenting a little bit more with AI tools. I do think in a lot of what we see, there's two big adoption behaviors that I think is interesting, and I think it links to the access and availability of tools. So a lot of the adoption, I believe, is driven by the types of tools that HR professionals have access to. So on the one side, we've spoken about Gen AI being quite prevalent, and that being the tool of choice, because it is a tool where you can get comfortable quite quickly, you can interact with it pretty seamlessly, and it always gives you an output. So I think that helps to build some of the confidence, and it's easy to think about ways to use generative AI tools to work smarter, faster, increase quality, etc. And if we think about most organizations, that's where they've made the investments, where you have Copilot or Gemini as part of your general tech stack, and most people have access. So I do think that drives some of the adoption behavior. But we also see in those areas like talent acquisition, talent management, that there is a lot of links to where AI tools are booming in the market. So the tech market also is exploding in those spaces. So a lot of it tends to be the availability of tools and buying new tool sets. I think that also accounts for some of the skewness in those areas, because there does seem to be a link between talent management, talent acquisition tool sets, learning and development, and in performance management to some extent. We've also seen quite a big boom in tool sets. So, and when we speak to clients, they'll often say, well, the reality is we don't have access to sophisticated tools, and they're quite worried about that. And I do think that will at some point create a bit of a plateau for what adoption will look like if we don't go beyond it being kind of vendor-led or tool-driven adoption.
I think definitely also what we've seen from a behavior point of view, and that you've rightfully mentioned in functions such as talent acquisition. I think if we think about L&D, it's typically the functions that also utilize AI to scale volume. I think it has been quite interesting for me, similar to your point that you've just made, to kind of watch what is happening in those spaces where we start applying AI. We also notoriously know talent acquisition is quite tricky from a legislative perspective and how we apply some of these tools. And there's some horrible examples that's come out over the last 3 years and actually beyond, even before AI was that mainstream, around some of the typical challenges that we do find there. I think to your point is also the confidence piece, right? I think HR professionals have become a lot more confident, but tool accessibility remains quite a key challenge. Something that we've picked up that's quite interesting is really this idea that Marna's mentioned: I equip my people, but then I don't expose them to the tool sets And something that we predict, at least from our side, is that shadow AI use is going to become a really, really big cybersecurity challenge for most organizations in the future. And I think in the HR context, the type of data and information that we work with, due to the fact that it's highly, highly personalized, is going to be, I think, a real challenge there as well. I want to remind everybody joining us today, please drop some of your questions also in the Q&A. I'll make sure that we cover those, not just at the end, but also during the course of our conversation there as well. I do want to double click a bit on the point, Elena, that you've made around actually that the adoption is starting bottom up and not top down. When we think about a lot of the, may I call them traditional change management type of approaches, there's usually this big starting point to say, get executive alignment, get executive buy-in. From there, we drive it top down and we cascade it through the organization and we reinforce it, etc. What came out of the report that contradicts that a little bit more? And when you say kind of bottom up type of AI adoption seems to be a lot more prevalent, what's the reason for that?
As in, what's the reason for us saying that the bottom-up approach is more
Yeah.
prevalent? Well, one of the things that we're seeing in the research is that many of the roles where employers, when they're currently recruiting for new people that have AI skills, they're actually recruiting them for actually very operational roles. So we're talking about the talent acquisition specialists, the recruiters, the L&D professionals, and we see fewer job ads for managerial positions within HR actually mentioning AI. So that is the way that we observe this pattern and make those claims.
Perfect. Marna, your view on that. How does that play out a little bit more in terms of how you believe HR professionals are approaching AI adoption?
Yeah, I think if we take a step back and think about the core work that gets done in HR, a lot of it is driven by processes or governance, and that in its very nature generates a lot of administrative burden, this thing that lives in our legacy that we've been trying to get rid of. So it made a lot of sense to me when I saw the report that a lot of the adoption would also happen at practitioner level, so people who are carrying that administrative burden and finding ways to utilize AI to get rid of that. So I think it made a lot of sense to me. I do think it's something to capitalize on because, again, to your point, we think about transformation and change management. There's going to have to have a strategy and then cascade it down, and then behaviors will follow. But you actually have a lot of practitioner level, so administrators, coordinators, even analysts who use AI, who are learning skills as they are practicing with it, experimenting, building those mindsets, and also debunking some of the myths and the scary things about AI. And I think if you can equip and enable those as your adoption champions, yes, strategy is important, but there's also something to be said for bottom up transformation that can happen. And I think it's a missed opportunity to kind of not capitalize on that because that's a natural phenomenon we are now seeing as well.
I'm
Yeah.
going to play devil's advocate. Oh, Elena, you go first.
Oh, no, actually, I wanted to jump in on that and actually connect to something you, Dieter, said about the shadow use of AI. So the insights that we have come from job postings data, right? And job postings data give us an understanding of what employers actually think when they are looking for a new role. So they explicitly mention in the job ads. And this doesn't even give us a picture of the full extent in which workers within the companies are using it. So to me, the fact that when we do see it explicitly mentioned in job ads is still on the operational side raises even more questions in relation to then the overall strategy in terms of adoption of AI in the sector.
No, I love that comment, and I think it's going to be so interesting to see, how it plays out. Because to be very honest, right, and I'll play devil's advocate here for a moment. When we think about previous HR technology adoption, very often we try to push that out into the organization, but it was typically the managers and the leaders that said, this is for the masses. It's not necessarily for me. I can still remember a story. We were implementing a Mobi app, and I could not get any of the executives to utilize it because their personal assistants actually used it on their behalf whenever they had to do something. So it was almost this perception a bit that it was for other people and not for me. And AI is definitely different when we start seeing how that actually plays out in the organization. Mana, when I come to you a little bit, and like I said, I'm going to play devil's advocate. So you are advocating for the fact that it's fantastic, bottom up, people are experimenting. It's the operational roles, Elena, that you've mentioned that we are definitely already scoping in AI skills as part of that. Do we not run the risk of going completely off the rails in organizations in terms of the adoption from the bottom up? What do we need to do to just guide and govern that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think it comes down to governance and how we set that up. So it's also putting up the guardrails that provide a lot of the do's and don'ts for HR professionals. But then also I think it has to go hand in hand with upskilling. So yes, we can
Mm,
experiment, but you also build a skill set up to a point. So I do think it's putting guardrails in place and being very clear around how AI is adopted within the organization, so it also doesn't break the core values of the organization or run into legislative risk. So I do think it's about guardrails to really capitalize on that. I don't think it's a let's just see what happens when everyone uses it or give them access to more things. But I think it is more capitalizing on the way that people are already naturally using AI and building those skill sets and building, I think of the mindset piece is for me more important if you are
mm.
using it in your day to day and capitalizing on that to drive adoption and build adoption champions.
No, David, and I think one of the articles that you wrote about this also spoke very much about the fact that it's going to require a different type of leadership behavior to set the guardrails, but let go of the control, because that's very, very different, right? I love your point that you made also around the fact that it's about not just the tool set, but it's a bit about the skill set. So we'll get to the upskilling piece in a moment. And also then a little bit more about the mindset piece. And we know, and there's already a really good question, Claire, that I'll get to in a moment there, around when we start thinking about how people think ethically about the application. Just because I can does not mean I should. Where should I be utilizing a lot of these tool sets, and where are they going to provide the most value for me in terms of that as well? I do want to take it slightly further when we start thinking about the skill. And my challenge whenever I hear the words, we need to upskill in AI is, what does that mean? Because AI skills means various different things for different people. And I think something that we've definitely picked up is really this idea around the fact that it has to be contextually relevant. So there's obviously things that's applicable to everyone, but then we do need to dive a little bit deeper just in terms of what that's going to look like. Before I jump in there, that we're going to ask a second poll just to hear from you in terms of what do you think is going to be the most important for HR professionals in the future? Is it the mastery of AI tools and data? Is it a lot more about the ability to translate AI insights into people's strategies? That talks a little bit about strategy work that we've just spoken about. Is it about emotional intelligence and empathy? So, also a very strong view there around that it's more the human side of things for the future. Is it cross functional business acumen? Or is it the courage to lead organizational change? Not to influence anybody's voting, but I love that last one. I think it's a very difficult time to be a leader, and you kind of have to step up a little bit with courage as well. As we run the poll there, Marna, Elena, if you had to gamble on which of these options stand out to you? I know it's very unscientific to ask you the question and put you on the spot, but nonetheless, here we are.
If we're going unscientific, I'm going to say all of the above, which was an option.
I think
Just
that's a
saying
little
it.
bit of a cop out, but nonetheless, fair enough. All of the above. Elena, your side?
I'm gonna go for option three, maybe more picking out the human side of AI, beyond AI.
Perfect. We'd love to see the results of the poll. What do people think on the line today? I think it's always so interesting to ask this question because I think a lot of it depends on context, as we've already
Mm.
spoken
Yep.
about, and what you've been exposed to. And the results are in. So nobody thinks it's about the mastery of AI tools, which I think is really, really interesting. I think if we asked this question probably about 2 years ago, that would have been the one that would have reached probably the highest level at that stage. Elena, a lot of people agree with you on the emotional intelligence front and empathy. So we'll deep dive into that a bit more in terms of the importance of the human side of things. I think in the HR context, we've seen a lot of that over the months up to now. Cross-functional, most definitely. So cross-functional business acumen, it's a skill that we talk a lot about in the HR context around how do we connect what we do with the business and showcase the value. And then some people that I definitely influenced in the incorrect way around the courage to be able to actually lead the AI transformation a little bit in the future there as well. So I want us to come back to the topic of skills and the upskilling conversation there as well. And Elena, I'm going to come to you first. We've already asked the question around this blend between technical skill, human side of skills there as well. But you actually found that it's not just about the technical AI skills specifically when we start thinking about HR. Can you elaborate a bit on what you found in the research here and what does that mean for the HR professional around the table?
Yes, and I've got one slide, but I want to make 2 points. So bear with me, and even if the second one doesn't have a visual. But so, yeah, the first point is very much what you were saying, Dieter, that what we are seeing is actually when we look at all these job postings that mention AI skills, actually, the top 10 skills that are most frequently mentioned by employers are only touching on AI twice. So out of the 10 skills that are most frequently mentioned, only 2 are related to AI. And they're quite broad too. So they're talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning in broad terms. But if we see the skill that is actually most frequently mentioned is around communication. Many of the others, like management, problem solving, customer service, they are deeply human skills. And this doesn't seem to be changing. If something is changing the opposite direction, in the sense that they're becoming more important. But I also want to go back to the point that you were making, Dieter, about how things need to be deeply contextualized in order to fully understand what skills mean in an AI context. And that is where, within this report, we developed a matrix that we call the AI skill disruption matrix, which basically looks at the top 50 skills that are most frequently mentioned in each job function, such as HR. And then we looked at how exposed to AI these skills are and how disruptive these skills will be in the next few years in terms of the role that they play within HR. So we can see whether they are exposed to AI or not, and whether they're growing or not, and the value they're bringing to the HR function. And what we see there is that among the most disruptive skills, of the skills that will change the HR function the most, many are actually not about, again, AI tools. They are deeply human skills, or skills that require knowledge of artificial intelligence to leverage for making human decisions. So strategic decision making, creative thinking, analytical thinking, etc. So it's very much, it seems like the audience is also in agreement on that. So we're preaching to the to people that already agree with us on that. But it seems like actually getting to know the specific AI tools is less relevant than actually knowing how to connect these tools to the broader function and strategic role they can play in it.
Perfect. I love the point that you make there around the skills are actually deeply human, but it's this balance between utilizing, for example, AI insights to make calls about real people in the organization. Because I think as an HR function, that's always something to keep top of mind. I think we definitely saw that in the past, with the development of people analytics, etc. You always have to remember at the other side of that process, policy, tool, data report, aggregated results, there's still a real human being, with certain elements that still has wants, needs, and desires. I think it's really interesting, and I want to just double click a little bit on that in terms of the AI exposure that you spoke about there, because I think obviously, and I'll call it out, the elephant in the room on the HR space is people ask this question around, am I going to be relevant in the future? And I think it's interesting when you do the research thing to see which skill sets would really be exposed to AI. And in my view, at least, I think it's a good news story. In the HR space, we've been talking so much about the fact that there's some work that we know we need to do because it's important in the organizational context, but it's not necessarily the most value adding work there as well. So without having you commit to anything, but if I ask this question a little bit in terms of the exposure to skill sets, what stands out for you there for HR specifically?
Well, I actually gonna be answering in a very similar directions to where you were going, in the sense that what we are seeing from the research and what we've been long talk about and discussing to this report as well, is that we are not seeing AI taking over jobs, but rather replacing tasks and augmenting our ability to carry out jobs. So when even earlier we mentioned some of the use cases of AI in HR, like speeding up the recruitment process by doing the initial screening. All these parts are being automated, and they almost give us more time to actually do the things where we need to spend more attention on, in terms of like assessing the candidates during real in-person or virtual, but still face-to-face interviews, and taking the strategic decisions. So yeah, not so much about job displacement, but the jobs will change and they look different. So I don't think the talent acquisition manager will disappear. The job they will do will be very different.
And I think that's such a good point to make, right? And I think we, Amanda, to come to you on that, also get that question quite a lot, right? I think this is fear around, what is it going to do to my job? And I think, Elena, I definitely agree with you. Your job will definitely change, but that's a good news story. And it's a positive thing when we start thinking about what this will look like for the future. Mana, talk to us a bit about, but how do HR professionals then start preparing? You've done a lot of work on when we talk about AI fluency in HR professionals and what that's going to look like. And it links a lot with what Elena has now mentioned around more the application of AI that goes beyond the tools and the replacement of tasks and activities. What is AI fluency and why do you call it that? And then we'll deep dive a little bit into just exactly how do we build that as HR professionals.
Yeah, I think the conversation about AI fluency started in two places. I think on the one hand, we know that HR professionals themselves now have to be equipped to be able to use AI because, as you've mentioned, Elena, work will look very different. So how you interact with work requires a new skill set. So on the one hand, we have that, but I think what is unique to HR as well is that we have to help business with their own AI transformation process. And so the skill set, when we talk about the AI skill set, it is very different, I think, to other functions. So that kind of prompted our research into AI fluency and defining what that skill set should look like because our core business is upskilling and making sure that HR professionals are ready, but we don't know what to upskill if we haven't defined what good looks like. So that's really where the research on AI fluency came from. And what we've ended up with is to actually um, embed AI fluency within our T-shaped competency model, which is how the model that we use to define the skills that will be needed for the future. So at the top of the T, so in the bar, we have 5 other core competencies related to how do I understand the business? Am I able to use data and tell the story of data? My digital agility, my people advocacy and execution excellence. And we think that AI fluency fits in there with all of those other core skills. It's not just about the technical components, but it is regardless of your role, the level that you're in. AI fluency will be something that you need to master. We still think, and you'll see in the stem of the T, specialist skills remain critically important. So you can only leverage AI or know where to use it if you also know your craft really well. So that will remain important. And then leadership skills, if you're in a leadership role, will remain important as well. So that's kind of in our thinking about skills for the future. We've plotted AI fluency. When we think about AI fluency for HR professionals, there's four things to get right. The first one, we can't get away from the technical components. So it is still important to have confidence in using AI applications. So understanding what different types of AI is, what different tools do, when is what appropriate, so that we can make informed decisions. But then also knowing how to interact with AI tools. So things like prompting is really important to master and is a little bit on the play on fluency. So learning a new language to interact with something that will be core part of your role. Beyond that, we also have responsible use. So on the one hand, it is being able to understand all of the ethical implications and the risks associated and that's inherent to AI, but then also being the conscience for the business to drive responsible use and the human impact of AI transformation in the business. Then we also have integration into workflow. So how do we think about AI as part of our workflow and not just as a tool that we pull in when we need it? And then the last one is around the adoption champions, which we are quite passionate about. We see a lot of success where HR teams learn AI together and they create environments where it's safe to experiment within guardrails and people can share their learnings and it takes some of the fear away. So when we talk about AI fluency, it's those 4 core things. So technical skills, definitely important, but more so all of the human or behavioral aspects that make those technical skills come to life in a responsible way, in a way that also transforms the organization as we go. So long answer to your question, but just to give it some perspective of where we see it fit in for the future.
No, I love that. Thanks so much, man. And I think that if I may build on your metaphor around AI fluency, when I think about, and I've been trying not too much success yet in terms of learning a new language, but there is that component around you need vocabulary, which I think is about how do we use the technical tools and engage with it. You need the grammar, so how do I put the different things together, and then you need the context in terms of where do I actually start to utilize. And I love the way that you've described AI fluency as part of a core thing that an HR professional tends to do. And it's not something that just sits outside of the work that we do. But an important point is still the mastery of the craft of the HR technical skill set. And I think that's such a good news story again when you are an HR professional to start listening about the fact that it is utilizing AI to amplify a lot of the things that we do. And it comes back to your point around work design, Elena, in terms of replacing some of the activities and the tasks and those types of different elements that we'll get to. Marna, I want to ask then a really practical question there around how do you build AI fluency? Because we've spoken about that there's experimentation happening. We've spoken about the fact that there's adoption in the organization. Help me make this practical. I'm going to use something that you often do to me, but it's like explain this to me like I'm a 12-year-old. What do I need to do to build AI fluency?
The fine print of that is I usually ask ChatGPT to explain it to me like a 12-year-old. But I think when we think about how we build AI fluency, it is knowing where you start from, because I think we all have a very low baseline, and I think it's important to know where you stand. So we also have an AI fluency assessment that is accessible, that anyone can use. Beyond that, there is a part that relates to education. So we also have to spend the time to really understand the nitty gritties of AI and AI tools. And regard, depending on where you find interest, you might know a lot of it, or like me, like not a lot. So there's an education component. There's also being equipped with the right tools. So as you mentioned, it's not just about learning theoretically about AI, but having the tools to actually go and use AI and build that confidence. And then there's also the experimentation piece. So being able to
Mm.
play with AI in a safe environment where I can see what different outputs look like. So when we talk about reducing bias, a big part of understanding the bias inherent to AI tools is actually playing and seeing what different outputs look like so that you can grasp what the input should look like. So I think those are probably the three big things: is to spend time on educating yourself, having the right equipment to be able to utilize and apply your skills so you build confidence. And then the last one, also just getting exposure to experiment with different tools as well.
I want to also ask the question then as a follow up, because I love the point that you make around, that it's about safe experimentation, it's about the exposure, it's about being equipped, being educated pertaining to that. I think whilst people are looking at the screen there, as Marna's mentioned, there is an AI fluency assessment that you can do for personalized recommendations that will measure you against just your current perception pertaining to the things that Marna's spoken about, your level of education, your integration of the tool sets into your daily work there as well. Man, I'm going to bring this question to you. It was asked, and my sincerest apologies if I mispronounced the name of one of our attendees. Begona asks this question, and firstly, thanks us for the relevant content, but then says, how do you see AI integrating into things like labor relations across your organization? How does that play out as part of AI fluency that you've mentioned around integrating it into our daily work?
Yeah, I think there's two parts, I think, to the question, if I understand it correctly. I think on the one hand, it does mean that how we think about labor relations has to evolve as well, because we have AI as an extension of the workforce to some extent. And I think that has implications for how we define labor relations. Not the expert in labor relations, so I won't put my neck out on what that means in practical terms, but I do think there's implications when AI is part of your workforce. I think labor relations in itself, I think AI has a massive role to play in
Mm,
augmenting or evolving labor relations as a practice. I think in some ways it makes it very accessible for employees, which downstream has impact on the amount of risk that we encounter. So when policies are explained in simple terms,
mm,
um, and employees kind of know what they are signing when they do receive the employee handbook, as an example. I also think AI can play a role in helping us sense check. So in most organizations, there's not big labor relations department. So you usually have one or two people. So it can also sense check and play devil's advocate, and be kind of that voice of reason. I think something that I'm quite interested in, that we see more in the talent management space, is that it can also help you with certain predictions, and it can help you anticipate, using data, which I know for the most part is very difficult to aggregate and pull into one place and use for other workforce decisions. So I do think there's a lot on the practice space it can augment.
mm.
And then I do think the other component is it does redefine what we see as our workforce and how we manage that from a labor relations perspective.
No, I love that. And what I'm hearing from you, there's almost the practice component, right, in terms of what labor relations is and what it needs to do. There's a little bit around how we use it with the workforce. And then I think there is also the implication of who the workforce is going to become when we start thinking about things like agentic AI. There's a very good case study, Begona, around that, an organization that's actually utilizing AI. They operate across various different regions with very different legislative types of contexts, but they're not big enough to actually have HR teams in all the different regions. So they actually utilize that a lot for at least first line, very, very basic kind of legal advice on what can I do here, what can't I do here, and interpretation of local labor legislation.
Yeah.
Now, again, I would urge you to still get a labor expert to check those things for you. I wouldn't just trust it off the bat, but I think it is an interesting one to look into around how do we make a lot of these things accessible. Because, and remember, I said I grew up in HR. As much as I love policies, I know nobody reads policies besides the HR team when we push them out, or you when you are in trouble and when you don't know what the policy actually says. So I think there is actually some interesting applications there around making things a lot more accessible. I'm going to urge you. I'm going to start wrapping up for us before we start shifting to the Q&A there. In terms of a couple of things that really stood out for me out of the conversation with the two of you. And thank you for providing such great insight around what's happening in the bigger world and then how we make that relevant to the HR professional today. And I think, Elena, you definitely spoke about the fact that I think AI adoption in organizations are at different places and in different functions are at different places. And that is okay. I think context plays into that quite a lot. I think we've heard also definitely around the fact that HR is significantly catching up, but in some areas of HR and not necessarily in all of them. We spoke quite a bit around the fact that the skill set is starting to change of the HR professional for the future, but some skill sets will have more or less exposure to AI in the future. And that's also going to play in quite significantly in terms of what AI fluency is going to look like. Mana, you stressed the fact definitely that AI fluency has to become a core competency for the HR professional in the future, and that we also build that not just through education, but also by equipping people, exposing people, allowing people to actually experiment with these tool sets in a safe environment. And something I really take from both of you is that this is a good news story for HR around how AI can actually redefine the function, help it step into its mandate. Since the 1990s, we've been pushing this narrative of HR as a strategic partner. And I actually think we're kind of at a stage now where the technology might have caught up that will actually allow us to be able to really step into the shoes there as well. There's a couple of questions here in the Q&A. Maybe, Ellen, I can come to you first on this one, and then Marna, I'll love to hear your view on this as well. We know the EU AI Act, we know that that has come into play. We know that there's other legislation also currently around the world that's starting to come into effect. How just do you think it will affect companies? What do you think will be some of the general things that organizations need to think about?
Yeah, there's something more that we need to learn about, and then we need to train ourselves in. That's in a nutshell how I see it playing out. And also that connects to the point of the discussion we were having earlier about the shadow adoption of AI. I think things like the EU AI Act are really putting those, pushing us, pressuring us to actually have a more organized approach, a company-wide approach to how we're using AI. And that could help us, but it's also a tricky balance in between innovation and managing regulations as well.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think what's interesting for me there is the response to the act. And Claire is asking the question for us has been quite interesting for me in different kind of segments where a lot of people say, finally, there's regulation. I know what I can and can't do. And there's other people that exactly make this point around, but how are we supposed to innovate within these confines and constraints? Man, I want to ask you the same question and a little bit with a caveat there that I spoke earlier about the fact that we know HR professionals, myself included, sometimes a little bit more risk averse, and we tend to wait for legislation before we take action. Now, I'm going to really talk about talent acquisition here because we know that talent acquisition has seen massive AI adoption already. And I know in the EU AI Act, that's one of the areas that's actually quite clear in terms of some of the things that's coming down the line. Your advice there, if I'm a talent acquisition or HR professional, EU AI Act, what is it that I need to be aware of, or at least start becoming aware of and learn more about?
Yeah, I do think for the first time, I don't think I would have ever said this, but I do think having legislation actually helps because for a lot of HR professionals, there's a lot of things that we know are risky, but we kind of don't know what we should be looking at. And a lot of these things are quite technical. So how you manage data and how you prepare data for systems and bias checks and all of those things are quite technical. And I think legislation like the EU AI Act helps just demystify what are those minimum legal requirements. Of course, it doesn't override what best practice is and organizational policy and what's ethical, kind of at a moral level. But I do think it provides some guidelines. So I think it is important to really familiarize yourself with the requirements of the Act. I do think it does now introduce a new consequence to not kind of following good practice, where in the past there was just no real consequence. So I do think it's important to familiarize yourself with the Act. There are actually a couple of sites that I found, websites, because we've just been developing content on this, that monitor changes to Act, and there's like simple explainers. So I do encourage HR professionals, if they do want to dive deeper, to follow those kind of AI watch sites, I think it's called, where they actually talk about the shift in legislation. And I do think it is just spending time on making sure that you understand, and then also spending time within the organization to what does the governance structure look like? Who is your go-to person? Because there's also an accountable person within your organization that you that you would have. And I don't think it's something that we have to manage on our own. There's a bigger support system
Yeah.
out there.
Most definitely, and I want to call out that last point that you've made, right? So I think what we've also seen, if I may add that to the conversation, is where AI adoption goes well in organizations. It is cross-functional. It is different parties sitting around the same table, and that includes legal, risk, operations, HR as well, sitting around the table and understanding what these things mean for us and what we can and cannot do. Second point I want to make here is that a lot of this is still new. So I think as a broader HR community, we must also engage in the conversation around how are people interpreting what is actually sitting within the EU AI Act and how do we apply it. For those of you that's dialing in from outside of the EU, I can promise you is legislation that's probably very close to that in your own region at the moment, or definitely coming if it's not already in place. So I think that as a community, we need to make sense of that the same way that, over the past years, we've made sense of kind of new legislation that started to come out, and also understand what does that mean in practice and what we can and what we can't do. Maxime, as a follow-up question for us here around HR is the second most growth in adoption in the last year compared to other functions or departments. What are the risks and rewards of such growth? So maybe, Man, I can come to you first, and then Elena, I'll come to you on that. What's the benefits of HR kind of really speeding up in terms of our adoption, and what risks do you see?
I do think it's a good news story for skills development, wearing my skills development hat. I do think we know AI skills developed through use. So the fact that more HR professionals are using AI tools is really a good news story. It means that we are creating confidence, we are building the right skill
Mm,
sets, and people also learn so they can make smarter decisions. I do think, and that's something that I mentioned earlier around the pressure, where we see a little bit of knee-jerk reaction. So when we don't think about the business case for AI, because there's a million things that AI can do, but we shouldn't necessarily use it. The question is not can AI do it, but should it do it, and how should it do it? So I do think sometimes we miss that piece, and then we see a lot of AI investments not provide a return, or we run into trouble where suddenly we've broken and we've created a lot of complexity into something that should have been simplified. So I do think on the one side, great for upskilling. On the other hand, it does mean that we might not be building enough understanding as we go to make certain bigger calls that are longer term investments. That would be my view on it.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point, and I think Maxime, also to add to that, I think there's also for me this idea that we will speed up. So as HR, as I've said before, we grow up in a process-driven environment, so very often we also suffer from perfectionism. We want to try and get things perfect before we shift things out. And I think a couple of years ago, when everybody was talking about HR needs to operate more like a product house, push things out earlier, improve it over time. I actually think there's a behavioral risk at the moment that we see of HR professionals keeping it very closely tied to what they do at the moment without sharing, without learning from others, and it being very individual based, which I think is also going to be a potential challenge if we don't harness that properly. Elena, same question to you. Maybe help connect us that a little bit to what do we know from some of the other functions as they've started to adopt faster. What are some of the things that HR can look out for?
Yes, and actually on this point, I also wanted to connect to something that you said earlier. We talked about different functions being on a different HR AI journey, and you said, Dieter, and this is okay. And I wanted to add to that actually it's not just okay, but it is good that it is this way. So at least we have
Yeah.
time to think about how to do it. And in some parts of of an organization, we can actually be proactive in the way we think about how to embed AI in the job function. If this growth happened at the same time in all the parts of an organization, we would have a deep problem in terms of managing the situation, and that's where maybe the broader functions and the fact that they're all in different journeys can help us think about this. IT is one of the areas that is faster ahead on the line, and we are seeing that AI is just becoming a normal tool as part of the job. Is almost getting to that point. If we think of new technologies as something that appears first as a skill, then it becomes an occupation and a whole role. That we're already seeing IT being on that journey. So they first needed AI skills. Now they're recruiting for AI engineers. So together, that's a whole new professions being created. And then the third part is when a technology is widely adopted, it almost becomes implicit in the job requirements of a role. So many of the job functions are still very much in the first phase or not even there yet. And so then the transition will be more and more on new jobs entirely being created related to AI.
Mm. And I think that's a great point, because I think for a lot of organizations, I think they're pushing this mandate around the fact that they say, you have to adopt AI, you have to adopt AI, you have to adopt AI. And as much as I think, and we've spoken about that, AI is important for all, definitely for HR and beyond. I think, Elena, to your point, it also does push out the narrative a little bit around, as an organizational leader, where do I hedge my bets a little bit more? So where do I foster that bottom up adoption and kind of simulate or stimulate that a little bit more in some areas more than in others, which I think is a clever way to also go about it, because I think we can learn so much. To your point, it would be absolute chaos if everybody was just pushing it. And it felt a little bit that way for me personally about 12 months ago or so, where I think everybody was just jumping onto the bandwagon, very little structure, shaped the conversation there a little bit more also then around, but what does this mean for us as well? I'm going to ask a last question to you. Thank you very much, everybody. Please, if you still have any questions, drop them into the Q&A and we can make sure that we get back to you. I'm going to ask both of you, before we start wrapping up, to stick out your necks a little bit. And I want you to look into your crystal ball into the future. We are having the same conversation in 2 years' time. Elena, my question to you is, what has shifted and what are we talking about in the AI space at that point? Marna, my question to you is going to be, where is HR in 2 years' time if we start looking at how AI is currently being adopted? So, Elena, if I can come to you first on this one.
What a question. I love it. And it's also extremely hard to answer. And it's funny because every time we work with organizations, the first thing we say is actually, we don't have a crystal ball and things are changing so fast that is actually even harder than ever. But if I had to place my bet on something in a couple of years' times, I think what the conversation could be like is more around what are the skills that you need to manage humans versus what are the skills that you need to manage AI, and how do you make the two interact with one another.
Oh, I absolutely love that one. I was in a debate the other day very much on if we are the last generation of people managing people and the next generation of managers has to manage agents and people, what is the skill set and what does that look like? Love it. Thanks so much, Elena, for sticking out your neck. Mana, where's HR in 2 years' time from
Yeah,
now?
I do think, I hope in 2 years' time we'll see a lot less siloed HR activity. So I do think the convergence of specialist fields and convergence of COEs into kind of dynamic pods that focus on addressing a particular problem using AI as part of kind of our workflows. I think that's probably what I would envision. I don't know if it will happen in 2 years, but definitely in the near future, I think that's where we will end up, because I do think AI enables a lot of the aspirations we've had in the profession, and it allows us to finally progress and transform. So I'm quite excited for what that will look like.
Yeah, can't agree with you more. I think, and I know it's such a cliche statement to say that, I think there's so much good things on the horizon for HR, and it's definitely an interesting time to be in the human resource management space. Marna, Elena, from my side, thank you very, very much for sharing your insights, and I think some really, really good tidbits for everybody to take away around where is AI currently, what does adoption look like, and what is the skill set of the future going to look like. On that note, Elena, I'm going to hand to you just to close to us, and thank you very much, everyone. There's a whole range of things that you can also utilize that has been shared by both people as they've started making those different points. But from my side, thank you very much. Elena, over to you.
Yeah, and thank you, Dieter, for moderating such an interesting discussion, and Marna and Dieter, both of you, for this partnership and working together on these joint articles. The links to the articles and to the report as well have already been put in the chat, but you can find the QR codes here. The slides from the webinar will be shared afterwards with you. And if you want to get in touch and find out more about either what Marna and Dieter have shared or what we've shared at Lightcast, please leave your email in the poll box that should be coming out at any moment now, or just get in touch with us afterwards. Thank you very much and see you next time.